The buggy was still moving when his hand touched my collar. We were maybe half a mile from the meeting house, the horses' hooves keeping that steady Sunday rhythm on the packed dirt, the harness bells small and cold in the morning air, and my husband reached over without a single word and turned my chin toward him. Not tenderly, the way you turn a jar to read the label. He looked at the seam of my cape, the set of my prayer covering, the line where my hair was parted underneath it. He checked the pins, he checked the fold. He tilted my face toward the gray light coming through the buggy's front glass so he could see me better. And I sat perfectly still and let him, my hands folded in my lap, my eyes down, because I did not yet know that a wife was allowed to be anything other than something to be checked. Before I tell you what he was looking for and what happened the one morning I failed the inspection, let me introduce myself. My name is Martha, and this is Hannah, the Amish girl, the channel where I tell you the things my community spent my whole life teaching me to swallow. I grew up old order Amish, and I left with nothing but the dress I was wearing and a bus ticket and a name that my own mother will no longer say out loud. If you want the truth about plain life from someone who actually lived inside it, and not the postcard version they sell you at the tourist shops, subscribe and tap that like button. It is free, and it tells the algorithm that stories like this one deserve to be heard. And in the comments, tell me one word for how you picture an Amish Sunday morning. I read every single one. Now let me explain what that inspection actually was, because I know that to you it sounds like something a man does to a horse, and not to his wife. In my community there was a thing that was never written in the Ordnung, our unwritten book of rules, and yet everyone obeyed it as if it had been carved in stone. Before church, the man of the house was responsible for the appearance of his household. Responsible. That was the word they used. If your prayer covering sat wrong, if a strand of hair had escaped, if your cape was pinned crooked or the color of your dress was one shade too bright, that was not your shame alone. It was his. A man was judged by the plainness of his wife the way he was judged by the straightness of his fence rows and the fatness of his cattle. A tidy, faithful-looking wife was proof he ran a godly home, so he checked. Every Sunday. Before the whole district could see her and decide. Here is what people on the outside do not understand. It did not feel like cruelty when it started. It felt like care. When Daniel first began checking my covering before church in the early weeks of our marriage, I thought it was sweet. I thought, he wants me to look right. He does not want me embarrassed in front of the older women who miss nothing. I did not have the words yet to understand the difference between being protected and being owned. Nobody ever gave me those words. You were supposed to feel the line between the two, and I could not feel it, because from the time I was a small girl, every hand that touched my appearance had called itself love. My mother's hands pinning my first covering, my grandmother's hands smoothing my hair before communion. By the time my husband's hands did it, my body had already been taught for 20 years that being arranged by someone else was the same thing as being cared for. Let me tell you exactly what he was allowed to inspect, because it was more than you think. The prayer covering first. The cup. It had to sit at the precise angle, the strings a certain way, the pleats even and pressed. In my district, the very shape of your covering told everyone which church you belonged to and how conservative your family was. A covering pushed too far back suggested vanity, a woman showing off her hairline. Pulled too far forward suggested you had something to hide. There was one correct position, and he was the one who confirmed I had found it. He checked it every week with 2 fingers at the temple, the hair underneath. Parted straight down the center, pulled back tight, wound and pinned, not a single strand loose. Loose hair was worldly. Loose hair suggested a woman who wanted to be looked at, and a woman who wanted to be looked at was already halfway to sin. He checked the part with his thumb, running it along the center line of my scalp to feel for anything out of place. The dress. The correct color for the season and the district. Nothing bright. Nothing that would catch a stranger's eye on the road. The hem the correct length, not an inch too short. The cape pinned Never buttoned because buttons were proud and pins were humble. He checked the pins by running 2 fingers down the front of the cape, and if one sat crooked, he would fix it himself, right there in the moving buggy, his knuckles against my collarbone. The apron over it, clean and pressed and tied at the exact place at the waist. The shoes, plain and black and free of any shine that might draw the eye. And then even the smaller things. The way I sat. Hands folded, back straight, eyes lowered, ankles together. All of it was his to look over before the district looked at the 2 of us walking in together and formed its quiet, permanent opinion of what kind of man he was. And I want you to understand something about Daniel before I go any further, because this part matters, and I will not let you turn him into a monster in your mind. He was not a cruel man. He was doing exactly what his own father had done to his mother every Sunday of his childhood. He had watched it 1,000 times from the back bench of a buggy before he ever did it to me. To him, checking me over on the way to church was not domination. It was the most ordinary thing in the world, the same as checking that the lantern was filled, or the gate was latched, or the horse was sound before a long drive. He had never once been told that a marriage could look any other way. Neither had I. And that is the thing I need you to sit with about the whole system I grew up inside. It did not need cruel men to keep it running. It only ever needed men who had never been shown that another way existed, and women who had been trained since birth to mistake being managed for being loved. There is a part of this story I cannot tell you here. Not on this platform. Not under these rules. The algorithm has limits, and I have learned exactly where they are. So I wrote the rest down instead, slowly, without the softening, without the cuts. Everything the camera is not permitted to show. The book is called The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down. 208 pages of what plain life looks like from the inside of it. The link is in the first comment of this video. That is where the part I could not say out loud lives. Now let me tell you about the morning I failed. It was a spring Sunday, the kind where the frost is still white on the fence rails, but the sun is already promising to burn it off by noon. I had been awake since 4. I had milked in the dark, my hands aching from the cold of the pails. I had cooked breakfast for Daniel and for his younger brother who boarded with us that season, fried eggs and scrapple and coffee thick enough to stand a spoon in. I had scrubbed the kitchen floor on my knees. And somewhere in all of that, in all that rising and bending and lifting before the sun was even up, a pin had worked itself loose on my covering, and I had not caught it. I did not know. You cannot see your own head. That is the small, cruel detail nobody ever thinks about. A woman is held fully responsible for how she looks in the one place on her body she cannot see without a mirror, and mirrors themselves were treated in my home as a doorway to vanity, allowed only briefly and used quickly, and never looked into for pleasure. We climbed into the buggy. The horse started up at a walk, then a trot. And 1/2 mile down that road, his hand came to my collar the way it always did, every Sunday, and this time it stopped. His thumb found the loose pin at the back of my covering, the fabric lifting slightly where it should have lain flat. I felt him go completely still beside me. He did not yell. That was never his way. He simply said very quietly, in Pennsylvania Dutch, the language we kept for the truest and the hardest things, "You cannot go in like this." And he turned the buggy around. We drove the whole way home in a silence so heavy I could hear my own blood, just so that I could fix a single pin at the kitchen mirror while he waited in the yard holding the reins. And then we drove the whole way back, and we were late, and being late to church in my community was not a small thing. It was noticed. It was remembered. It was turned over quietly by the women at the meal afterward. When we finally walked in, every head in that room did the small thing that heads do. That flick, that measuring glance that lands on you and moves on and tells you nothing and everything. I felt the heat climb up my neck and into my face, and on the way home that afternoon, Daniel was not angry with me. It was worse than angry. He was ashamed, and his shame filled the whole buggy from floor to roof. And somehow, without a single word being said, I understood that his shame was my doing, that I had failed to make him look faithful in front of his people, that a wife's whole purpose, when you stripped away everything else, was to be a thing a man could present to the world as proof of his own goodness. I want you to sit with that for a moment. I was 20 years old. I had been awake since 4 a.m. I had milked and cooked and cleaned and fed 3 grown people before the sun came up. And the sin, the actual sin that hung between us in that buggy like smoke, was a single pin I could not see on the back of a head I was not even permitted to look at. My friend Rebecca had it worse than I did, and I only understood how much worse many years later. Her husband did not check her in the privacy of the buggy where at least the road was empty. He checked her on the front porch, in full view of anyone driving past, because he said a thing done in the open kept a woman honest and kept a man from being deceived. She stood on that porch every Sunday morning and let him turn her chin and check her pins and straighten her cape while the neighbors' buggies rolled by on the road, and she smiled the whole time because a woman who did not smile through it was proud, and pride was the very worst thing a plain woman could be accused of. She told me once, whispering in her pantry the way we always whispered the true things, with the door half open so it would not look like secrecy, that somewhere along the way she had simply stopped feeling it. That she had learned to stand there on the porch and send her mind somewhere far off out past the fields until it was over and he took his hands away and told her she would do. I did not understand then that what she was describing to me had a name. I have learned the name for it since, in a quiet office with a box of tissues on the table between me and a woman who had never once in her life turned my chin toward the light. Because here is what nobody in that world will ever say to you out loud. The inspection was never really about the covering or the pins or the exact color of the dress. Those things were only the surface, only what the hands could reach. What was actually being inspected, every single Sunday of a woman's married life, was whether she had kept herself small enough, whether she had disappeared enough into the role. A loose strand of hair was never really a problem of tidiness. It was evidence. Evidence that somewhere down inside the woman there was still a part of her that wanted to be seen as herself, and wanting to be seen was understood to be the first hairline crack in the whole structure, so they checked for it. Week after week, thumb along the part, fingers down the cape, they checked for the self. And a good wife learned to hand hers over at the collar before the buggy had even reached the top of the lane. I did not leave because of the inspections. I want to be honest with you about that because I do not want you walking away thinking one single thing pushed me out the door. It is almost never one thing. I left slowly, the way a person wakes slowly, one small wrongness at a time, until there are too many of them stacked up beside the bed and you simply cannot fall back asleep no matter how you try. But I remember the exact morning the inspection stopped feeling like care. It was an ordinary Sunday, nothing special about it. His hand came to my collar the way it had 1,000 times before, and instead of feeling looked after, I felt, for the very first time, looked over, counted, inventoried, the way he inventoried the tools in the shop before winter. And once I had felt that, I could never unfeel it again. I think some part of me knew in that moment that I had already begun to leave, even though my body stayed for 2 more years, even though I kept folding my hands and lowering my eyes and letting him check the pins. Before I got out, my younger sister Katie came to me. She was newly married that year, glowing with it, and she sat on the edge of my bed the way she had when we were girls and asked me something in a small voice. She said her husband had started checking her covering before church, and she did not know if she was doing it right, and she wanted to know how to be sure she never gave him cause for shame. And I looked at my baby sister, at her hopeful face, and I felt something break open in my chest. I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to say, Katie, the covering is not the point. You are the point, and they are checking to see how much of you is left. But I did not have those words yet myself. So I only held her hands and told her that no pin was worth her disappearing, and she looked at me like I had spoken in a language she did not know because I had. I pray about that conversation still. I hope she has found her own way to the words by now. When I finally got out, when the shunning came down over me like a barn door swinging shut, when the letters I sent came back unopened and my mother would not say my name on the telephone, I found my way eventually to a therapist in the English world. And I told her about the buggy almost as a joke, almost as a quaint little curiosity, the way you offer up a tender piece of yourself and wait to see whether it is safe in the room. I said, "You know, my husband used to check my appearance before church every Sunday." And she did not laugh. She did not smile the way the tourists smile when they hear something quaint about plain people. She got very quiet and she looked at me, and she said 7 words that I have carried with me every day since. She said, "That was not inspection. That was ownership." 7 words. And something inside me that had been holding its breath for 20 years finally let it go. Because that is the thing I most want you to understand, whoever you are, wherever you happen to grow up. Control does not always arrive as a raised hand or a locked door or a shout across a room. Sometimes it arrives as a gentle thumb straightening your collar in the morning light. Sometimes it wears the exact face of care, and it calls itself care, right up until the moment you realize you were never truly being cared for at all. You were being maintained, like a fence line, like a filled lantern, like a well-kept thing that reflects well on the man who owns it. And I will tell you both truths, because I always tell you both. And I would not be honest if I only told you one. The Amish world gave me things I will carry to my grave. A community so close it has a texture you could reach out and touch. People who showed up for every birth and every burial and every barn raising without being asked and without ever once sending a bill. Hands that could raise a whole barn between sunup and sundown. A faith that, wounded and complicated as it now is, still lives somewhere down in me and always will. Those things were real, and I will not pretend they were not. But there is no scripture anywhere that makes a woman into a thing to be presented. There is no verse that turns a wife into the evidence of her husband's faithfulness. There is no God that I believe in now who would make a woman's whole self, every thought and want and light inside her, and then ask her to hand all of it over at the collar every Sunday morning, before she was even allowed to walk into his house and worship him. If you grew up in a place where being checked over was called being loved, I see you. If someone in your life straightened you and corrected you and arranged you and called all of it care, for so long that you finally could not tell the difference anymore, I see you too. You were not too much. You were not proud for wanting to be seen as yourself. Wanting to be seen was never the crack in you that they told you it was. It was the last living part of you, the part that would not go quiet, no matter how many Sundays they checked for it. And the fact that it survived at all, the fact that it is still in there right now, is the bravest thing about you. If you want to read the version of this story that YouTube will not allow, the full pages are in The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down, first comment of this video. And that is everything. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.